All right, so some of the problems you're going to be dealing with in your thought primer homework involve arguments that are more complex than the arguments we've been looking at in the previous lectures. So I want to go over some strategies here to help you contend with those kinds of arguments. So you're going to get arguments that look like this. It's going to be a mess of letters, some brackets, some parentheses, tildes all over the place. And the challenge for you is going to be to identify what's actually going on in all of this mess, and can I associate what's going on with one of the known argument forms that I have. So when you have an argument like this one, for example, you want to figure out what's going on, and the best way to do that is to identify the main operators of your statements. Okay, so we see that in the first premise we have a horseshoe, in the second premise we have a wedge as the main operator, and then our conclusion is simply Q. Okay, now we want to look to see, okay, so what's actually happening here? What's the relationship between these premise statements? And what we'll notice is that the second premise is identical to what appears on the left-hand side of the horseshoe. So what the second premise is doing is it's saying, I'm affirming for you that what appears on the left-hand side of the horseshoe in the first premise is true, and then the argument claims, and because of that, what appears on the right-hand side of the argument would also be true. So we consult our handy guide to all of the known argument forms we've talked about so far, and we look to see which of these forms seems to reflect what's actually occurring in this given argument. And when we do that, we see, aha, this argument, it's really a modus ponens. This is a valid argument. What's happening here is that the second premise is affirming what appears on the left-hand side of the horseshoe, which would make the conclusion true. Okay, now taking a look at an argument like this. Okay, main operators. Operators other than tilde outside of parentheses, unless tilde is the only operator outside of parentheses. So we can see here that our first premise is a wedge statement. That's the main operator. And our second premise has only tildes outside of parentheses. Okay, so what's going on in this argument? Well, again, we should recognize that the second premise here, P triple bar H, is very similar to the left-hand side of our wedge up here. The only difference is that in the first premise, it's tilde P triple bar H, and in the second premise, it's tilde tilde. Okay, what's that doing? Well, that double tilde is taking away the option that was presented in this first premise. Tilde P triple bar H was presented to us as one of two possible options in the first premise, and the second premise takes that option away, leaving us with the second option required to be true in order for this wedge statement to be true. And that tells us this argument with all of its tildes is really a disjunctive syllogism, right? We have one of the premises taking away or eliminating one of the options that was presented in the other premise. All right, now we've really got something messy going on here. We've got a bunch of stuff in these two premises and a pretty lengthy conclusion. We got to identify the main operators. We've got horseshoes all the way down, okay? That should signal to us, okay, this might be a hypothetical syllogism. It will be a valid hypothetical syllogism if the links in the chain aren't broken. If the last statement of one of the premises is the first statement of one of the other premises. And we see here that it's not, okay? We have an invalid attempted hypothetical syllogism because this statement that the premises share in common appears on the right-hand side of both of the horseshoes, and it's not getting passed off from one premise to the next, okay? So this is an attempted hypothetical syllogism, but it's an invalid one. All right, now finally take a look at this one. We've got another mess of statements here, and we can see in our first premise we have the horseshoe as the main operator, and in the second premise the dot is the main operator, and our conclusion appears to be this statement in the first premise, except that it's been negated in the conclusion. Okay, so what's going on here? Well, we can see that one of the things the premises have in common is this statement J dot B. But notice that it appears with a tilde in the first premise, and that tilde is gone in the second premise, okay? And that tells us that what the second premise is doing is it's denying what appears on the right-hand side of the horseshoe. Because if J dot B is true, then tilde J dot B would have to be false, okay? So we have a modus tollens, an argument in which one of the premises denies the consequent of the other premise, okay? And that's a valid form of argument. So as you're contending with these arguments in your thought primer homework, just try to stay focused on step by step, identifying what's actually going on in the argument, and use your guides to valid argument forms, and focus on the main operators and the statements that the premises seem to share in common.